I saw reduced images pass back and forth, carts and people walking along the street projected upside down on the ceiling. I had on other occasions observed and reproduced at will this phenomenon, due to small holes in the shutters which made my room act as a photographic camera. And I knew that these images corresponded to real people who were in the street in the bright glare of the sun. But in my weak state, these distorted figures, which came into focus only for a moment, all appeared to me to be real angels. I then thought, if Dulita with her two friends should happen to pass by, I would see her on my ceiling. This, however, was very unlikely, for she always, or almost always, came home from school by way of the street running parallel to ours. But even the slightest glimmer of the possibility that she might pass by deeply stirred me by the most contradictory representations, in which displeasure, expectation, hope, pride, and illusion dimly mingled in an agony of uneasiness. Two thoughts stronger than the rest came to light, nevertheless, in the chaos of my anxiety. Number one, if she should happen to pass across the ceiling, I would be the one to be below. Number two, if her head was down, she would fall down into empty space. I always saw her from behind, with her delicate waist fall back into the black void, where she would break in two like a white porcelain egg cup. She deserved this for not having been willing to come up to my rooftop, but at the last moment I wanted to save her. I stirred on my bed, torn by a frightful remorse, and I then felt the burning pain of the key of torture encrusted with all the force of my weight in the bones of my neck. And I then felt my love for Dulita, for Goluchka Rediviva, once more become localized there, just where I felt the pain. The following day, my parents decided to send me to the country for a rest. I was to visit the Pitcho family. This family has played an important role in my life and has had a great influence on it. My parents before me had already undergone the influence of the personality of the Pitcho family. All of them were artists and possessed great gifts and an unerring taste. Ramon Pichot was a painter, Ricardo a cellist, Louis a violinist, Maria a contralto who sang in opera. Pepito was perhaps the most artistic of all, without, however, having cultivated any of the fine arts in particular. But it was he who created the house at Caracas, and who had a unique sense of the garden and of life in general. Mercedes, too, was a Pichot 100%, and she was possessed of a mystical and fanatical sense of the house. She married that great Spanish poet, Eduardo Marquina, who brought to the picturesque realism of this Catalonian family the Castilian note of austerity and of delicacy which was necessary for the climate of civilization of the Pichot family to achieve its exact point of maturity. The following day, my parents decided to send me to the country for a rest. I was to visit the Pichot family, who had a property situated in the plain 2 hours from Figueres. The property was called El Mulli de la Torre, the Tower Mill. I had never yet been there, but this name struck me as wonderful. I accordingly consented to go, with a stoic resignation in which the image of the tower, one of my favorite myths, played a tempting role. Also, my departure for the Mulli de la Torre would serve me as a means of vengeance against Dulita, since she did not come up to my roof as I had hoped, and as I still expected her to every evening. At the same time, my trip would enable me to soften my rancor, while encouraging my hope of recovering with all my former fanaticism that beloved solitude which had just been shaken and compromised by the encounter with Dulita in a way so disconcerting to my spirit. I started off in a cart with Signor and Signora Pichot and Julia, their adopted daughter of 16, who had long black hair. Signor Pichot drove the cart himself. He was one of the handsomest men I have ever seen, with an ebony beard and mustache and long curly hair. To enliven the horse at the moment when the latter seemed about to sink into laziness, he had merely to produce a curious sound with his tongue, and for this he had to keep his teeth pressed together while at the same time opening and distending his lips as much as possible with a grimacing contraction of his cheeks. The sun glistened on his perfect white teeth as on petrified gardenias moistened with saliva. The horse, responsive to the noise Signor Pichot made with his mouth, would start off again at a gentle gallop, giving a new note to the monotonous tinkling of the bells. We arrived just after sunset, the Mully de la Tour. This spot was objectively one of the richest properties in the countryside and contained a large number of pictures painted by Signor R. Pichot. We arrived just after sunset. The Mully de la Tour impressed me as a magic spot. It was made on purpose for the continuation of my waking fantasies and dreams. It is in this spot of the Mully de la Tour that most of my reveries during the whole rest of my life have taken place, especially those of an erotic character, which I wrote down in 1932. One of these, having as protagonists Gala and Dulita, was published in La Surrealisme au service de la Révolution, but the very special character of the text prevents including it in the present work. I felt as if I had miraculously recovered my health in a single instant, and nothing remained of my anxious and melancholy lassitude of the preceding days. On the contrary, a delirious joy unpredictably and repeatedly took hold of me. The boiled potato, well sprinkled with olive oil and a rapid pinch of salt, made my mouth water, and a sentiment of uninterrupted satisfaction gave me a constant thrill of well-being that each of the minute events inherent in the progressive adaptation to and discovery of the place only accentuated with the marinated red pimento that this kind of small surprise always constitutes when the place to which you have arrived gives you the certainty that it is, quote, for you, end of quote, and that reciprocally for your part, your loyalty toward it from the first decisive contact of the threshold can never henceforth know any limits. The next day the sun rose, the countryside was deafening with greenery and the song of insects. The month of May beat in my temples the caressing and fluorescent drums of nuptial palpitations. My love for Dulita, while it grew, mingled with the frenzied pantheism of the landscape and became impregnated with that viscous and digestive sap, which is the very same that lifts toward the summer sky the slow and convulsed stalk of the plant, forming a transparent drop upon its uttermost tip, tense with the glorious pain of growth. My love for Dulita, whose face I had not yet seen, spread over all things and became a sentiment so general that the idea of the slightest possibility of her real presence would have horrified and disappointed me. I would adore her and at the same time remain more alone, more ferociously alone than ever. The mechanical side of the mill interested me very little, but its monotonous noise quickly became assimilated to my imagination, and I immediately considered it as the continual presence of the memory of something absent serving, with its majestic recall, to protect the solemn side of my solitude. The tower, on the other hand, as the reader of this book already initiated to my tastes will readily understand, became the sacred spot, the tabernacle, the mansion of sacrifice, and it was, in fact, up in the tower that I perpetrated the sacrifice. This will be recounted minutely, and as well as my own emotion will allow me, at the exact end of this chapter. I had to wait 2 days before I was able to climb, quote, up there, end of quote. Someone was always going to bring the key. Finally, on the third day, they opened the door which gave access to the upper terrace of the tower. And from this moment, the clear and rotting water of my impatience could flow tumultuously, just as cascades of dizziness succeed stagnant emotions, long contained by the dam of censorship which regulates the melancholy course of the majestic canal of life. The height of the summit of the tower where I found myself exceeded everything I had imagined. I leaned over the edge and spat. I saw my spittle become smaller and disappear in a mass of dark vegetation from which emerged the remnants of an old chicken coop. Beyond one saw the slow course of a little stream running into the mill dam. Still farther on began the limits of those earthly paradises of kitchen gardens which served as foreground and were like garlands to a whole theory of landscape which was crowned by the successive plains of the mountains, whose Leonardo-esque geology rivaled in rigor of structure the hard analytical silhouettes of the admirably drawn clouds of the Catalonian sky. If Dulita had been there, I would have made her lean very far over the edge, at the same time holding her back so she would not fall. This would have given her an awful scare. The following day, I determined the methodical distribution of the events of my future days. For with my avidity for all things, resulting from my new and bubbling vitality, I felt that I needed a minimum of order so as not to destroy my enthusiasm in contradictory and simultaneous desires. For I now wanted to take frenzied advantage of everything all at once, to be everywhere at the same moment. I understood very quickly that with the disorder in which I went about wanting to enjoy and bite and touch everything, I would in the end not be able to taste or savor anything at all, and that the more I clutched at pleasure, attempting to profit by the gluttonous economy of a single gesture, the more this pleasure would slip and escape from my too avid hands. The systematic principle which has been the glory of Salvador Dali began thus to manifest itself at this time in the meditated program in which all my impulses were weighed, a Jesuitical and meticulous program whereby I traced out for myself in advance the plan not only of the events, but also of the kind of emotion. The systematic principle which has been the glory of Salvador Dali began thus to manifest itself at this time in the meditated program in which all my impulses were weighed, a Jesuitical and meticulous program whereby I traced out for myself in advance the plan not only of the events but also of the kind of emotion I was to derive from them during the whole length of my days to follow that promised to be so substantial. But my systematic principle of action consisted as much in the perverse premeditation of this program as in the rigor and discipline which, once the plan was adopted, I devoted to making its execution strictly and severely exacting. Already at this age I learned an essential truth, namely that an inquisition was necessary to give a, quote, form, end of quote, to the Bacchic multiplicity and promiscuity of my desires. This inquisition I invented myself for the sole use of the discipline of my own spirit. Here, in its main outlines, is the program of my auto-inquisitorial days of the Mulli della Torre. My rising had always to involve an exhibitionistic ritual inspired by my nakedness. To carry this out, I always had to be awake before Julia came into my room to open my window in the morning. This awakening, which I effected by the sheer force of my will, was a torture because of the exhausting events that filled my days. Every morning I was devoured by sleep. I succeeded nevertheless in waking up with a great punctuality, that is to say 15 minutes before Julia came in. I used this interval to savor the erotic emotion which I was going to derive from my act, and especially to invent the pose which varied daily, and which each morning had to correspond to the renewed desire of, quote, showing myself naked, end of quote, in the attitude that would appear most troubling to myself and at the same time be capable of producing the greatest effect upon Julia. I tried out my gestures until the last moment when I heard Julia's approaching footsteps. Then I definitely had to make up my mind, and this last moment of bewilderment was one of the most voluptuous in my incipient exhibitionism. The moment I heard the door open, I remained frozen in a tense immobility, simulating peaceful slumber. But anyone who had looked at me attentively would readily have noticed my agitation, for my body was seized with such violent trembling that I had to clench my teeth firmly to prevent them from chattering. Julia would open the two shutters of the window, come over to my bed, and cover my nakedness with the sheets, which I had let drop to the floor or piled at my feet as if by restless movements I might have made in the course of my sleep. Having done this, she would kiss me on the brow to wake me up. At that age, I thought myself ideally beautiful, and the pleasure which I experienced at feeling myself looked at was so vivid that I could not resign myself to getting dressed before this pleasure had been repeated once more. To this end, I had to invent a new pretext, and I would frantically review in my mind the list of such projects carefully worked out the previous evening before going to sleep, and which constituted the 1,001 manners of my morning exhibitionism. Quote, Julia, these buttons are all gone. Julia, put some iodine here on my upper thigh. Julia, end of quote. After which came breakfast, which was served on the large table of the dining room for me alone. 2 large pieces of toast drenched with honey, and a glass of very hot coffee and milk. The walls of the dining room were entirely covered with oil paintings and colored etchings, most of them originals by Ramon Pichot, who at this time lived in Paris and who was the brother of Pepito Pichot. These breakfasts were my discovery of French Impressionism, the school of painting which has in fact made the deepest impression on me in my life, because it represented my first contact with an anti-academic and revolutionary aesthetic theory. I did not have eyes enough to see all that I wanted to see in those thick and formless daubs of paint, which seemed to splash the canvas as if by chance, in the most capricious and nonchalant fashion. Yet as one looked at them from a certain distance and squinting one's eyes, suddenly there occurred that incomprehensible miracle of vision by virtue of which this musically colored medley became organized, transformed into pure reality. The air, the distances, the instantaneous luminous moment, the entire world of phenomena sprang from the chaos. R. Pichot's oldest painting recalled the stylistic and iconographic formulae characteristic of Toulouse-Lautrec. I squeezed from these pictures all the literary residue of 1900, the eroticism of which burned deep in my throat like a drop of Armagnac, swallowed the wrong way. I remember especially a dancer of the Bal Tabarin dressing. Her face was perversely naive, and she had red hairs under her arms. But the paintings that filled me with the greatest wonder were the most recent ones, in which deliquescent impressionism ended in certain canvases by frankly adopting in an almost uniform manner the pointillist formula. The systematic juxtaposition of orange and violet produced in me a kind of illusion and sentimental joy like that which I had always experienced in looking at objects through a prism, which edged with them with the colors of the rainbow. There happened to be in the dining room a crystal carafe stopper through which everything became impressionistic. Often I would carry this stopper in my pocket to observe the scene through the crystal and see it impressionistically. Suddenly I would realize that I had exceeded the time allotted to breakfast, and my contemplation would always end with a, quote, shock of violent remorse, end of quote, which caused me to swallow my last mouthful of coffee and milk the wrong way, and it would spill down my neck and wet my chest inside my clothes. I found a singular pleasure in feeling this hot coffee dry on my skin, cooling slowly and leaving a slightly sticky and agreeable moisture. I became so fond of this moisture that I finally purposely produced it. With a quick glance, I would assure myself that Julia was not looking, and then just before she went out, I would pour directly from the cup a sufficient quantity of coffee and milk, which would wet me down to my belly. One day I was caught red-handed doing this, and for years the story was told by Signor and Signora Pichot as one of the 1,000 bizarre anecdotes relating to my alarming personality which they adored to collect. They would always begin by asking, "Do you know what Salvador has done now?" Everyone would prick up his ears, prepared to hear about one of those strange fantasies which were utterly incomprehensible, but always had the power to make everyone laugh till the tears rolled. The sole exception was my father, who by his worried smile could not but betray the anguish of menacing doubts about my future.